Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Hot Seat on Full Sail Live. I'm Josh Taylor, and joining me today to share his insights on his career in sports is writer and co-host on the World Soccer Talk podcast, Kartik Krishnaiyer. Kartik, thanks for joining me on the show today.
Okay. Thank you for having me. Looking forward to it.
Kartik, how did you get involved with World Soccer Talk?
So it's interesting. 2006 World Cup happens, and I discovered this site EPL Talk at the time, and writing a note to the publisher saying, "Hey, I like your content, etc." Uh, and I had listened to the podcast. I think actually that's what it was. He had done this interview series, and I generally didn't do that. I just generally didn't reach out to media about things. And sure enough, it turned out he was in South Florida. He was in Lake Worth at the time. I was in either Coral Springs or Delray Beach, but I was nearby to him, Christopher Harris. So we got friendly, and by the next year, next summer, 2007, I had launched a new site under his network umbrella, MLS Talk, and launched a new podcast, which was about Major League Soccer and the lower divisions of U.S. Soccer. USL was the only one at the time, really, and the U.S. men's national team and women's national team, and it went from there. So that was it was just kind of a shot in the dark when I reached out to him. I had not really done much sports writing or podcasting. I had been effectively, a political consultant and did a lot of political writing. I had dabbled in the sports writing thing a bit, writing about University of Miami basketball on a blog site that I had. That was my own blog site that I've now sold, related to basketball in 2004, 2005, 2006, that time period. But I didn't really have any actual deep sports writing or sports journalism experience. I had, like I said, writing about college basketball or writing about Hurricanes basketball. They were in the ACC. Was more just going to the games as a fan and analyzing them or watching them on television. Right? I hadn't actually had press access or applied for press access. So, but I picked it up pretty quickly in 2007, and by the end of 2007, I was hosting the American Soccer Show on the now defunct Champion Soccer Radio Network, which brought a show that I was co-hosting about MLS and the U.S. men's national team. Basically, got a little bit of USL in there, got a little bit of women's soccer in there. Definitely Yanks Abroad. So Yanks Abroad was a big part of it, and we had tons of Americans in the Premier League at the time on to kind of a mainstream radio platform, because those shows were distributed on Sirius. I forgot what channel it was. This is before they had Sirius FC, XMFC, and also via Sports Byline. It might have been actually just via whatever channel Sports Byline bought time on Sirius. But so that put me in kind of a more mainstream role, and then the rest kind of went from there.
Kartik, what were some of the challenges when you started covering soccer? Because at that time, 2005, 2006, 2007, it wasn't quite mainstream then like it is now.
Correct. No, it wasn't even anywhere close to where it is now. It was pretty challenging to find anyone who was interested in the sport, and very challenging to find any coverage of the sport outside of blog sites. And finding games also involved a lot of streaming, even very early on. I think soccer fans are savvier about the streaming thing, because in 2006, 2007, we had to find these games, which were buried usually on ESPN 360, it was at the time, right? For precursor to ESPN 3. So, or buy additional packages, like there was a package by an Irish company called Setanta Sports, and buy their streaming online package. And web speeds weren't quite as good, built with a lot of buffering in those days. A lot of excess content that was just thrown onto these streaming platforms. So that was one challenge, and I think obviously even the matches were on behind paywalls, or not even paywalls, but these premium cable channels, Gold TV, Fox Soccer Channel, etc., where they were difficult to actually find games. You did get your Champions League games, two of them a week on ESPN2, and then you would also have MLS on ESPN networks, but no one was watching MLS in those days, and they were down to 10 teams or 12 teams, I guess, at that point. So that was difficult. What was much easier was because the sport was small and was kind of a niche, it was easier to get access. So by 2007, late 2007, I had access to much of the U.S. landscape. I'd say by the start of the MLS season in 2008, I had access to that entire league. I had access to U.S. soccer and the U.S. men's national team. I was able to actually go to London to cover a friendly against the U.S. played against England at Wembley in 2008. That I built into another trip, which I paid for myself, but was able to get access right while I was in London to the team, which was the important thing, even though I paid for myself. That that sort of thing I don't think would happen now. I don't think you can just kind of walk in at that level now. Now then, what ended up happening after? Because I guess I'm not I'm not a soft touch, right? I've been pretty critical in my coverage. So what ended up happening after that was I had numerous spats with leagues and the federation through the years. So actually, lost access at times, etc.
Kartik, you mentioned earlier that you've been working with Christopher Harris when you got this thing started. How was it? You've been working together for a long time. How has that chemistry developed since you guys started?
Yeah, it's been relatively good. I mean, I think we have some of the same interests in terms of covering soccer media and kind of the same opinions about um, global football and English football, and then U.S. soccer. I don't know if we always had the same opinion about U.S. soccer, but he's gotten there over time. I was far more kind of skeptical, I guess, from an earlier stage. Actually, Chris might have been too. Now that I think about it, so we've been kind of on the same wavelength in terms of our our understanding of one another, and then we've become close personal friends. Obviously, some proximity to one another. He's now moved up to the St. Augustine, Jacksonville area as of a few years ago. But still, we're in very close proximity to one another in terms of still being in the state of Florida. So, yeah, it's been a really good relationship. We've seen a lot of people come and go through the World Soccer Talk Network, but the two of us have remained quite close through the years. And obviously, there was a period of time, I should mention, between 2010 and 2013 or late 2009 and early 2013 that I was still on the weekly podcast, but I had stopped writing because I was working for the North American Soccer League as their press officer, as their communications officer. So there is a period of about 3.5 years where I stopped writing and stopped broadcast. Well, actually, I shouldn't say I stopped broadcasting. I was broadcasting for the league I was working for at the time, narrating the highlight clips, our weekly highlight show. I narrated. I didn't do actually any broadcasting myself on air, but sort of chose the broadcasters and prepped the broadcasters. And then eventually, and I guess this is important also to note, I have jumped back to work for teams at various times. So after I left the NASL, a year later, I started broadcasting the Fort Lauderdale Strikers games, which is my local team. And I had actually broadcast their games. I guess I should rewind. I had actually been on the broadcast team for that same club 2008 and 2009 as the co-commentator, as the studio, as not the studio analyst, the match analyst, the color commentator. That team was called Miami FC at the time. I know this gets confusing. Lower Division Soccer gets confusing. Miami FC became the Fort Lauderdale Strikers and were in the league I was working for, the NASL. So after I left the league in early 2013, I ended up finishing the 2013 season narrating the highlight clips for NASL. Even after I left the league, I continued to do that. 2014, I became the play-by-play commentator, the main commentator for the Fort Lauderdale Strikers television broadcast. Left that in 2015. Didn't do that in 2015. The team came under new ownership. That ownership didn't want to retain me, which was fine. They actually brought in Bruce Silverman, who now does your radio games for Orlando City up there. So Bruce replaced me in 2015, and I did some radio work for the club, which was hosting their kind of radio post-game show, but it wasn't on any sort of terrestrial radio. It was uploaded to the team's website. Then in 2016, they made the decision. However it happened, Bruce then leaves and goes to Miami FC, which was a new Miami FC, another team owned by Ricardo Silva, who's a broadcasting mogul. And then I come back and do the Strikers games in 2016. And, actually, let me rewind. I had actually then, before that, been hired back by the club to be a press officer for the club and a media relations person. And then Bruce leaves and goes down the street about 20 miles to Miami FC. So I ended up broadcasting the Strikers games in 2016. Ended up doing a few games for CBS Sports Network, which I know everybody thinks they're new to soccer with NWSL and Champions League this last couple months. They actually did do the NASL games, or an NASL match a week in 2016, and I did a few of those matches. I think I did 2 of them, and actually still have my CBS Sports shirt and all of that from that. The Strikers then go defunct, and lo and behold, I end up at Miami FC down the road, working with Ricardo Silva and the ownership group on the media side again. And we had an issue with Bruce's partner, and so they replaced him with me in the middle of the 2018 season. And then 2019, I was the press officer for the club and started the season as the broadcaster, and then realized it was very difficult to do both. And so I backed off the broadcasting and allowed our friends, wonderful guy, Lee Ifans from Magic City Soccer, who's really one of the savants now in lower division soccer, let Lee and his crew take that over, and I went back to just being the press officer for the second half of the 2019 season. And I have not done any broadcasting in 2020, interestingly enough. I mean, it's the first year in a while between the NASL years and then working for these former NASL clubs, Strikers and Miami FC. And I did, by the way, the broadcast for the entire Sunshine Conference of NPSL for a couple seasons. So I actually have done games from Winter Park, up your way, Winter Park High School, and I think I might have done a game at Rollins and did a game at Trinity High School, Trinity Prep, which is out a little further east, but has technically a Winter Park address in that NPSL Sunshine Conference, because there's always games being hosted in Central Florida. So in 2017 and 2018, various matches I was called in to do those broadcasts. So now this year, 2020, with all the everything going on around us, just kind of back to being a podcaster and a writer, which is the first time I've been that without actually broadcasting on television or streaming, which is kind of nice. You know, I have to admit, toward the end, the broadcasting thing, it seems very glamorous and it's really cool at first, but I think you have to have a different kind of mindset or psychology than I do to be a superstar in that and keep going. I will be honest, I got tired of it, and that's why I was only too happy when there were capable replacements at Miami FC, where I said, as I mentioned, I was working last season in our summer break, which was around this time last year, just take myself off the broadcast and say, okay, I'm still going to prep you guys. I'm still the media officer, but I'm not going to actually physically go on camera.
And Kartik, I'm just curious, what was your mindset when you were doing preparation for broadcasting games?
Yeah, so prep is so important. I don't want to come across as too nasty here, but I have very low tolerance for people who come in unprepared. And too often I would find broadcasters, and this goes back to my experience as the press officer at the NASL and being the press officer also for Strikers and Miami FC, and doing some consulting as a media operations person for some other clubs, that there would be too many broadcasters who were unprepared and came in and winged it, or would come in, let's say kickoff time is 7:30, would show up at the stadium at 6 or 6:15, and would have a like a single piece of paper and a pen and start asking me questions without having actually prepped, without actually having looked at the roster, without actually having watched, let's say it was a home match for Fort Lauderdale, without having actually watched the previous match where they were away, or without having watched the team they were playing previously, unless they had played the home team before. So I have a very low tolerance for that. What's involved in prep is watching previous matches, pulling up statistics, rosters, vital information, learning to pronounce the players' names properly, which is another issue. And I'll admit, at times I've been bad at that. And sometimes there are teams that are not properly staffed and they don't have pronunciation guides in their media materials, if they have media materials at all, right? Or they don't have the sort of information that you need to give to a broadcaster for them to sound as good and as professional as they can. But generally, that's not the problem, right? Generally, it's often the broadcaster themselves, being lazy, being unprepared, relying on instinct when they're watching a match. And some of that is important, right? Particularly for co-commentators. They have to have some color commentators, co-commentators, whichever term you prefer. Sometimes they have to have just kind of this instinctive analytical feel. But at times they're not prepared either. They may see a player do something, yeah, and say, "Oh my gosh, that's amazing," or "Oh, this guy is terrible," without having watched his previous match, his or her previous match. So that would be a frustration. I think prep is important. You need to have historical context. You need to know what these matches mean for the clubs involved. You need to understand something also, and this is where I would run into some trouble. When you are doing a broadcast for a home team, and a lot of people like to be homers on these broadcasts, the majority of people watching, in most of the cases, are fans of the away team. So I always try to be objective as I could be, which got me in trouble. By the way, again, I was on the broadcast for two clubs that I was an employee of, and I got into trouble with the coaches of both of those teams. Got called into the office one day from the strikers. I mean, I was in the office, right, but got called back to the coach's office and got reamed for being overly objective on the air. I wouldn't even say I was being critical, being overly objective. It's our broadcast. You work for the team. You're supposed to be basically cheerleading. But I said to the coach, look, we were playing Indy 11, and everybody who was watching the game was probably a fan of theirs, with the exception of maybe 1,000 people. Our fans were at the game. So I've always taken that perspective, and I know that's not what a lot of managers do. And then in Miami FC, I had a similar problem after one of the matches where our manager thought I was talking about Atlanta too much. And it's our broadcast. And I said, well, yeah, but the people in Atlanta were watching the game. It was a postseason match, right? And I knew a number of them, right? I knew a number of Atlanta FC fans who were watching that match. So it was, okay, I'm not going to say, oh yeah, my team is terrible. I'm not going to do, but I'm going to call it as I see it, particularly considering there is another team involved and their fans are watching. And more importantly, I would always, in my game prep, my match prep, try and get some historical facts and something relevant about the opposing team. If again, it's a home broadcast, to try and to try and be balanced and try and give those fans watching something. Now, when I was working for the league, for NASL, that was much easier, and there was no such problem because they were all our teams. They were all the league's properties. There was no need to placate one fan base over the other, right, or to be biased one direction or another. But with being a home broadcaster or a broadcaster for a club, a team broadcast is difficult. And I think the thing we're finding as more and more of these media outlets are going to streaming, you're seeing more home broadcasts, right? More home broadcasts popping up on the ESPN Pluses or the CBS All Access, et cetera, platforms, and less kind of objective national type or balanced type broadcast. So that's a challenge, I think, and that's something that I took very seriously was making sure I understood and that the whoever I was working with understood that there is another team playing in this game and their fans are probably watching, and it is not fair to to be overtly biased.
Kartik, how did you deal with people that you work with that weren't prepared? How did you handle? Just take me to your mindset. How did you handle that situation?
Yeah, I didn't have much tolerance for it. I mean, I would sugarcoat it with them. I mean, I would tell them, hey, next time we have a match here, you need to do more. You need to be ready. You need to know about the other team. I mean, in a lot of the cases, this is when I was the NASL communications director, and I would be either. I mean, Fort Lauderdale was my home team, so I would be at their game. I would be at their games and Tampa Bay games more often than the other games. And the Tampa Bay broadcasters were always very good. But Fort Lauderdale, we had people who came and went who were not prepared, who were maybe guys who were covering other teams in town and other sports, and we had contracted with them to come in and they didn't know much about the other teams. And same thing, I would find it when I would travel for the league to other places. Um, I would try and give them as much in terms of media materials and media notes. And so if they weren't prepared one week, it would be the next week I'd be like, okay, I better put together notes with statistics, historical things, pronunciation guide, some random facts that can throw into a broadcast about the other team also, so that they get on air and don't just flub it. But then there would be times, quite frankly, you would put together these pages of match notes, and that was something I was very big on as a press officer, having kind of a TV spotters guide also. All of these things that you do that are kind of traits of the industry, right? That are industry standard, and you would send it to the broadcaster, and then the broadcaster would be telling you Saturday at 2 o'clock when the match kicked off at 7. Oh, hey, yeah, I got your email earlier in the week. I'll look over it before I come to the game. And I'd be thinking, yeah, I sent it to you on Tuesday for a reason. So the match is Saturday. I understand you're busy. You probably were doing other soccer games. You might have been doing some college basketball. You might have been doing some other sports in that period. But at least give it a look. At least familiarize yourself with it before you come to the match, and you're not aware of any of these sorts of things. So that would always be very difficult if you had a good producer. So I would say one thing that was very good about that final year with the Fort Lauderdale Strikers in 2016, we were working with a company called Ross Productions, and they were, because we were putting on a full television broadcast, so we needed a legitimate production company to come in and do those games. The producer would take it upon himself to prepare. In fact, since I was the media officer for the club, also the producer would get in touch with me early in the week. It's like, give me what you've got. Maybe my talent isn't going to be up to it, so I'm gonna prep them, which was fantastic, and that's what producers should do. Eventually, as I said during that season, Bruce Silverman had left, and we had a couple of other issues that forced me to actually go ahead and take over those broadcasts myself and work with that same production team. So then at that point it was fine. But sometimes it's the producer's job, but it shouldn't really fall on the producers because they've got a lot of stuff on their plate, and it's a difficult job. And it's a underappreciated job, and they're the ones who make the broadcasters look good. But in terms of my lack of patience for people who were not prepared, it was really upsetting to me. I would ream some of the broadcasters after matches, after they came off the air, and it was obvious they had. I knew when they showed up at the match they weren't prepared, but at that point you want them to have a good call and do it. But I had more than one incident like that where I've just said, look, I mean, if this isn't going to work, then we're going to have to find another broadcaster. You're going to have to prepare. You're going to have to know something about the players. If you need me to get you on the phone with the coach next week on Thursday so you understand what this team is trying to do, then let's set that up. If you need me to get you on the line with the coach of the other team, I will contact the other team's press officer And I am sure they'll be happy to set up some time with you to talk to the other coach. Now, this is something that's standard in the business. There is also deception that goes on because unfortunately there are a lot of coaches that don't want to give away what they think are company secrets to a broadcaster. So um, sometimes coaches are not very helpful in that preparation process. And in that case, you have to cut the broadcaster some slack. It's down to a coach being paranoid, down to a coach thinking that they're going to keep their tactics close to the vest. I mean, there are even, in some, you may have seen a couple of weeks ago on Twitter, I made a comment about I can't remember which MLS team it was, but Matt Doyle was making a comment about, oh well, they're not even they're putting the lineup in the wrong formation, something. And I said, hey, as a former press officer, I can tell you that there were coaches who would tell me to do that as the press officer, because there were the same coaches who would tell me, oh, we don't prepare the broadcasters because what if the broadcaster talks to his sister, who is friends with this one, who's friends with that one, who knows the coach of the other team, our strategy will be given away. So there's some paranoia among coaches, but I made the comment that, hey, I've been involved with coaches who will deliberately make me put the Twitter out an hour before the match, right? I mean, it's not like we're talking about 5 days before the match with the players in the wrong positions tactically, and the formation wrong. And then there were other people who worked in soccer too, or worked in MLS or USL or NASL, who said, yeah, that happened with me. Yeah, my coach did that. So that's becoming a common thing now in the social media world, that you're trying to put one over on the other side, on the other team. But broadcasters just have to deal with that. And by the way, there's so much on Twitter these days that it's also much easier to do research today if you're a broadcaster than it was 10 years ago.
Kartik, I'm glad you brought that personal experience of your situation up, because at my school we always discuss about preparing for games, and my instructors have told me you want to be unbiased. You want to share information about not just Rollins, because we have a partnership with Rollins College, but also the team that they play in the conference. And it's very important to prepare for games. So I remember I had to prepare for a soccer game I was color commentating for last year, and had to spend 3-4 days to research players. And I've told people from my experience doing freelance work for the Cup US, with the amateurs, it's not like you can go on Google and you see the roster and boom, it's like, no, because they may not update it for a while. Yeah. And you have to do research, like call the coaches or call people, hey, who's on your roster? Who's this? So for the Rollins, it was kind of a similar thing where I had some of the rosters, but they may have new students come in to play the team, and had to prepare, adjust, get lineups, and share the audience what you know. So I agree, preparation, especially for television or radio or podcasting, whatever you do, it's important.
Let me give you an example right along those lines. When I mentioned I did the NPSL Sunshine Conference broadcast for a couple of years, most of the players are players that are, now there are some professional players in that league, and I don't want to get into the whole kind of division between professional teams and amateur teams in that league, but the teams in Central Florida tended to be amateur teams that had a lot of kids who were coming from academies in the area, whether it was the academy up in Longwood or an academy down in Lake Nona, or they were Rollins players or UCF players on summer break. So oftentimes the prep involved me networking with whoever at UCF and whoever at Rollins to get information. And similar thing for the Jacksonville teams. It was usually UNF and JU players that were on summer break, and they were allowed to play in this league only outside of the NCAA windows. So basically, they can only play May to early August, right? These are the rules and how they're able to be in a league where there are also professional players playing. That's the NCAA rules. So basically, you would get a roster at the beginning of the season sometimes, and none of these guys would be on the roster. And then they would show up on the roster because, hey, NCAA, the spring semester is over at UCF, the spring semester is over at Rollins, the spring semester is over at UNF. And now they're on your roster sheet, right? And you need to find out about them. And the coach who's coaching this team doesn't know them. He hasn't had them, right? So you have to call the athletic director or sports information director at UNF or at Rollins, at UCF, and get that information. So it is challenging, and that also happens too as rules. And I don't know where we're going to go with this, honestly, but I think there's going to be more loosening of rules, especially combination of COVID. And I know that college soccer wants to either have a full year where they can keep the players. So they're playing in both the fall and spring season, so they get more practices, so players develop quicker, because, a lot of players are just skipping college now for that reason. Or there's going to be some sort of reformation, which is going to allow more of these college kids to play in these semi-professional leagues. And when I say semi-pro, like I said, NPSL, some of the teams are pro, some of the teams are amateur. And the way that league is structured, you have pro teams playing amateur teams, right? You're either entirely pro or you're entirely amateur. And the college kids, the ones that are on break from UCF and JU, et cetera, they can go only to the amateur teams. But the amateur teams play against professional teams. So that's there might be an expansion of that goes on if the college soccer season isn't expanded. Point is, for broadcasters, that's more challenging because you're not going to just be able to call the team that they're playing for and get information. I learned this firsthand my own way. What ended up happening is I ended up having to talk to UCF sports information side to find out about certain players.
I'm Josh Taylor, and this is the Hot Seat on Full Sail Live. And in case you missed anything, joining us right now is writer and co-host on the World Soccer Talk podcast, Kartik Krishnaiyer. Kartik, just was curious with your show, World Soccer Talk, because we're talking about soccer. You have different topics. So I remember when I first listened to the show, you had Napoleon Chopra, Kartik, you were on there, and Chris, and you all were talking about, I spent a lot of time talking about the Premier League.
Yeah.
But a few years ago, you all made a change on the formats for the show to make it more broadcast focused. So what led to that?
Yeah.
What you decided to change the format?
Pretty skeptical when we changed the format, honestly. I mean, it was Chris Harris's decision. And as it turns out, we have more to, because I thought we wouldn't have enough to talk about every week, because we were reviewing 10 Premier League matches a week. We were doing a whip around with Serie A, Bundesliga, La Liga, whatever else was going on around Europe. What ended up happening was we ended up having more to talk about because timing was perfect. 2016 is when the decision was made by Christopher to move to this new format. And at that time, you had a bunch of new media players going into the space, seeking rights. Turner, Amazon Prime, Netflix has released however many soccer documentaries now that we talk about, and DAZN and John Skipper over at DAZN, obviously very interested in acquiring soccer properties, and now we see CBS making a big play in soccer. So it ended up being perfect timing, and we have more to talk about every week, talking specifically about broadcasting and media rights than we did when we did the previous podcast. To be honest with you, I mean, there is so much content, so much going on in the media space every week. Now, obviously, like everything else, COVID interrupted that, and we were struggling to find things to talk about during that 2-month period when everything was shut down. But then once the world reopened, there was more media horse trading than ever, because there were some companies that were in worse shape than they had been pre-COVID and had to offload rights. Others that sensed the opportunity, media properties being cheaper, and further shifts towards streaming content. So, it actually has gone quite well. And I think the thing that's been good for me is, as someone who has done broadcasting and has been behind the camera and behind the mic, I have a greater appreciation for what broadcasters do. So there are some that are really good, like Taylor Twellman and John Champion, right? They're the top MLS team for ESPN. Taylor Twellman probably is watching 12 games at one time. He's probably watching 8 MLS games, 12 TVs, 8 MLS games, a couple Premier League, a couple Bundesliga, a couple Serie A. He always knows what's going on, and he's always very well prepared on air. Other commentators, and I'm not going to name names, other commentators, other people in studio, other studio analysts aren't as well prepared. And they're just winging it on air. And going back to preparation, which we've talked about, Josh, since we started the show, right? I now have a greater appreciation and greater understanding of that. And I can tell most of the time who's well prepared and who isn't, who's winging it. So that then comes out in my analysis on the podcast.
Well, speaking of your podcast, I know each week you and Chris go on the show on Thursdays, and you always talk about current events. So I just picked a couple of current events we can have a little conversation about before we wrap up the show. So the first one I wanted to touch on was, you mentioned CBS Sports. They recently picked up not just the National Women's Soccer League, but they also picked up the UEFA Champions League a year early because Turner dropped out. And I just want to hear your thoughts on how CBS has done with the presentation with both the NWSL and UEFA Champions League, and do you think they might pick up more sports properties in the future?
Yeah, I think they've exceeded expectations. I mean, on the NWSL side, NWSL Productions, which is right down the street from me here in Fort Lauderdale, they do a good job already. But now there's a CBS layer to it, CBS production layer, and CBS production standards. So they've done really well with NWSL, and they haven't messed with the broadcast teams too much. Jen Hildreth continues to be the lead commentator for the league, as she has been for basically the league's entire existence, and people like Ali Wagner, Lori Lindsay, Mike Watts, who's very good, who was also based down here, have cycled through. So that's been positive. On the Champions League side, they have knocked it out of the park, right? To use a baseball analogy, they have taken the very finest of CBS sports production. They've taken CBS's experience from broadcasting the NFL and broadcasting the Masters and the PGA Tour, the PGA Championship, and their previous experience with the U.S. Open in tennis. They don't obviously that went to ESPN a number of years ago, but CBS broadcast that for decades. College basketball and the NCAA tournament, etc. And they have applied that now to soccer, to European football. And so they put the layers of production that you have at CBS, really professional production and camera work, and studio setup. You marry that with some of the top English language commentators in the business, and you bring them over to CBS. You put your studio in London, and it's been fantastic. It's the best production and presentation of soccer I think we've ever seen in the United States in English language. Now, the thing I would say, and CBS has said to me, is that they got kind of lucky. Okay, they knew they wanted this property. They had 30 days once Turner opted out of the contract, and they picked it up because obviously they were already picking it up for 3 seasons further down the road. They'd already won the rights for the next rights cycle. Now they've picked up the last year and a half of Turner's rights, so they'll have it for a total of 4.5 years. They already had kind of conceptually an idea of what they wanted to do, but they didn't have much time once this fell in their lap, and they had to do this quickly. And as the season resumed, they were picking up the rights. What they've told me is they were fortunate in that because of COVID, there were travel restrictions. So the type of talent that was available to them was much greater than normally would have been available because those people would have been traveling. They would have been working for other broadcasters, but because everybody who was based in the United Kingdom, none of them could go to the continent, right? None of them could go on holiday even. After the end of the Premier League season, you had Clive Tilsley, you had Peter Drury, you had Jim Beglin, you had Jamie Carragher, Roberto Martinez, and Mika Richards, basically ready to take the call. And Jermaine Genius, huge addition to their team, actually, after they started and did a fantastic job on the final. So they got a little bit lucky, but you still see the level of production, the level of quality and care CBS gives. And this is going to force, in my opinion, NBC to up their game in their Premier League coverage. And ESPN, I think, is very, very good in how they present things, but this is going to give them a little bit of a kick in the rear end and saying, okay, we can get that much better.
Do you think NBC and ESPN are going to change to keep up with CBS Sports?
Yeah, I think NBC is going to have to get a little more analytical in their studio coverage. So they have been the last few years, and I don't think this was the case when they first broadcast the Premier League. I thought they were really good for several years. But the last 2 seasons, and I want to date it to when Comcast bought Sky Sports, bought Sky Television in the UK. And they incorporated some of these kind of very lazy, sensational type Sky narratives into their presentation. But now NBC is very much driven by what Jose Mourinho does on a given week, what transfer gossip is out there, what locker room intrigue there might be, and that's interesting. That's one component of studio shows and analysis, but they're not as good anymore at the tactical analysis in studio, the kind of anticipation of what kind of moves managers are going to make, the sort of analysis we saw on CBS. So I think NBC really needs to up their kind of analytical game, both pre and post match, and even their interviews, stuff like that. I mean, we saw CBS really excel at that with Rafa Honigstein and others, Guillaume Balagwe being involved with CBS's coverage, some top journalists. We haven't really had that with NBC. They had Neil Ashton for a while. He's now gone off doing his own thing in the consulting business, PR consulting. So there's a void there. ESPN, I think it might be more tweaks, right? I think that they have all the personnel in place. They've just brought on Kay Murray, who's very, very good. She came from BN. They have Dan Thomas, who's outstanding at hosting that ESPN FC show, Seb Salazar, and others as studio presence. As I mentioned, they have Champion and Twellman, who are excellent calling matches, even when it's Moreno and Adrian Healy. Ali Moreno and Adrian Healy, outstanding. Maybe it's just kind of giving some small touches to their presentation, doing a couple of more analytical things, maybe some more kind of special features. And actually, since you have me today, I'm going to say, and I'm sure when everybody's going to watch this, but SportsCenter will have an SC features on Gio Reyna this Sunday. From Borussia Dortmund, and that's going to be a really cool kind of soccer piece on SportsCenter that we haven't seen ESPN normally do. And I don't know if that's them being pushed by CBS. They're saying to me that it's because of their new deal with the Bundesliga, and yes, Bundesliga moves to ESPN next month, so they've got an impetus to build in coverage of the Bundesliga on SportsCenter, which is great. But I also think it might have to do with CBS being so good at those sort of human interest stories and features and analysis these first couple months that they've really dug into the sport between NWSL and Champions League and Europa League to kind of give ESPN the impetus to go, okay, we got the Bundesliga starting mid-September on our ESPN networks. Let's throw a big-time SportsCenter feature for Sunday morning SportsCenter. It's a long-form piece. It's going to be about 15 minutes on Sunday on one of the players that I think is most intriguing for American audiences in Gio Reyna, who, of course, is maybe the best young American player under the age of 20 right now.
Kartik, I'm going to focus on MLS for a little bit here for the next topic. How do you think MLS has adjusted to handling with the COVID-19 pandemic? We saw in MLS with MLS is Back tournament, which was a great tournament. We did really well with the television ratings. But now the MLS clubs have returned to their home markets. How do you think MLS has handled the COVID-19 pandemic so far?
Yeah, so this is a tough one because I think they did really well, really, really well at first. So they aborted March 12th or 13th. I think 12th was the date that they called the season. They didn't come back until they had proper safety protocols, testing protocols. I think it was Central Florida was a little bit of an odd place to do it. I think we can both agree on that because of the situation in the state of Florida, and that had me very concerned. And I think people who follow me on Twitter know I was especially concerned about MLS coming into this state at a time when cases in Orange County and in Osceola County were spiking. But they pulled it off. And after a week, you could tell it was really working. They had embraced Black Lives Matter. They had taken COVID very seriously. They had really created a lot of goodwill. And I was quite impressed by it. Now, they go through that, and then they turn around and start having fans at games in home venues the night after MLS's back ends with that Nashville-Dallas match. I was also, and this is personally me, I mean, I realize people have differences of opinion on this, when Reggie Cannon, who is one of the better players in MLS, kneeled for the national anthem, he had stuff thrown at him at that game. Now, first of all, I don't think fans should be there. There are no fans attending matches in European leagues, and they're a little past the little further down along the COVID curve than we are. Secondly, that sort of disrespect and hooliganism towards a player who is expressing his constitutional right to dissent, to me, just sickened me. So that was the night after a really good kind of feel-good final between Portland and Orlando that we watched from Walt Disney World, from Wide World of Sports. The next night, or 2 nights later, I think it was, the whole thing begins to be ruined for me. And then subsequently in the 2 weeks since then, we've seen more of these problems. We've seen fans at games, not necessarily social distancing. And then last night, for you guys up in Orlando, there were fans there at the game. I couldn't believe that they opened the game to fans in the state of Florida at this point. So, and that MLS now has said they're relying on local authorities. Well, I think that's a cop-out. They need to be better than that. Local authorities are often going to give in to the pressure, and I know this coming from a political background, are going to give in to the pressure of local businesses to open up. MLS has to be better than that. They have to be like the leagues in Europe, which are, okay, we know that there's an economic hit to it, but we're going to lead by example and keep everybody safe. So I think they went from doing a very good job, I would have given them an A, to now doing a really poor job. I give them a D since. So I guess, you average that together, that's like a B minus, C plus. Let's see what happens from here on out. But I'm disappointed in that they had such success with MLS's back. They had everybody in a bubble. They had cut COVID completely out of that bubble. The two teams that had come in with COVID, Dallas and Nashville, were rightly sent home, and also were honestly, they had gotten COVID they brought COVID in because they had not shown up in Orlando when they should have shown up. So I don't blame the league for that. I blame those two clubs for it. So I think the league rightly said, okay, Nashville, you show up in Central Florida, 5 days before their first match? So first of all, the reason we wanted you here 2 weeks early was so that we could eliminate COVID from the bubble. So you're bringing it in, we're going to send you back. I thought that was absolutely the right decision, and give Don Garber full props for that. But then what they've done since that tournament ended, I'm not happy with. And I have to say that it's been even worse among lower divisions. USL has been completely reckless in my mind. So has NISA, even though NISA has now just in the last week allowed fans into their games. They've had teams traveling. So there's it's not just about fans being at games. I think when you travel, there are other elements of travel, staying in hotels, going to restaurants, using public facilities that exposes the players and team staff to risks that they wouldn't have in a bubble. So that's why I'm so confused about this, because MLS had it right for March, April, May, June, July, early August. So they had it right for like 5.5 months, and then radically took this sharp turn to the other direction, and now have it so wrong. So I don't know what happened internally in that period that made them shift completely. But I haven't been happy about it the last few weeks.
That's a good point you mentioned, Kartik, and we've seen not just with MLS, but other sports leagues when the whole COVID-19 situation happened and they were trying to figure out what to do. Like you mentioned, when we talked about earlier, MLS did a bubble. The WNBA, who's down the road in the Bradenton in Florida, they did a bubble as well. You have other sports leagues. The NHL is doing their bubble in Canada. And Canada's been a lot stricter with the whole COVID-19 than we are.
Yep.
And you also have the situation in other sports leagues where MLB, they've been all over the place, but teams like the Marlins and the Cardinals and the Mets recently have had COVID outbreaks and had to sit out for a couple weeks. And the NFL is planning to start next month, as well as college football. So it's just how, and of course the NBA, they've been here in Orlando. So it's just been so crazy how you have some sports leagues that are doing bubble or regional schedules, but are doing okay. And then you have others that are going all over the place. But I wanted to touch on something you mentioned, Kartik. Of course, the other thing besides COVID that's been affecting sports is Black Lives Matter.
Yeah.
And we saw what happened early this week in Wisconsin, in Kenosha, Wisconsin, with Jacob Blake and the police, what they did to him. And after we saw a few months prior to what happened with George Floyd in Minnesota. And a lot of the sports leagues have had to deal with this. Major League Soccer as well. When Black Lives Matter was going on, they said, we support the players. We encourage them to speak their mind and use their platform. And that's great. But what happened yesterday here in Orlando, there was a lot of confusion. We were hearing about Nani and the Nashville SC players talking about sitting out after what happened with the NBA, the Milwaukee Bucks and the Orlando Magic postponing that game. And then the NBA announced all the games were postponing. And then, so we saw some MLB teams sitting out and everything. The only league that didn't have any players sit out was the NHL. And Major League Soccer, while the game was going on, released a statement, we need to encourage the players to speak up and everything, and we support the movement. But then during the Nashville SC game and Orlando City game, they postponed all the other games. So the players didn't find out until after the game, like, oh, why did we could have just not played. Now it feels super awkward. So Kartik, what are your thoughts on how, not just MLS specifically, how these sports leagues are trying to help their players, encourage them to take a stand, but dealing with this at the same time?
Yeah, so I want to give MLS full props for allowing the demonstration at the beginning of the tournament, the MLS back tournament, the Orlando-Miami game, and then allowing it to continue, these sorts of demonstrations, and the league being a partner with the black players, and then with all the players, and with the players union getting involved in it too. So I was very appreciative of that, and I think that that's something that's very good. I don't know what the miscommunication was in Orlando last night, but it was pretty clear from the other venues that the players weren't going to take the field. In fact, here in Fort Lauderdale, Miami and Atlanta took the field to take a group picture saying Black Lives Matter. That's why they took the field, right? And then they did what they did, right? They showed that they were unified in protest. They were unified in opposition to what had happened in Kenosha, what's happened to George Floyd, what's happened to so many African Americans and black people in terms of police brutality in this country. For the sports leagues, they have to be. And look, I approach this. Look, I'm a professional. I am also, and it should, in the interest of full disclosure, I am also someone who's been very active throughout much of my life, and continue to be active on the left side of politics, right, on the blue side. So I have my own personal views on these, and I'm in full sympathy and in full reverence of what the athletes are doing and whatever stand they're taking, and was so excited yesterday at this time. Actually, this news broke at this time that the Bucks were doing what they were doing. By the way, I am a Bucks fan, right? I'm a Heat fan also, but I grew up. I was born in Milwaukee, or in West Dallas, just outside Milwaukee. So I don't really follow the NBA very closely anymore, but I do consider myself a Bucks fan and a Brewers fan and a Packers fan in those sports. I don't follow those sports as closely anymore. Although, I follow college basketball, and I consider myself, besides, I went to the University of Florida, so I'm a Gator fan. I'm a Hurricane fan, as I mentioned earlier. My first sports writing was basketball, because I am a fan of, grew up a Miami fan, but I'm also a Marquette fan. So I do have my ties to Milwaukee. Marquette would be the other team I root for in college basketball. But I think it's difficult for the owners here. A lot of the owners have very different political views than their players. That is not necessarily true in the NBA. And a lot of the people who have been executives in the NBA have historically been kind of to the left. And that there has always been, I used to say this when I cover and really followed college sports even more closely than I do today, was that I could even tell the divide between people who were kind of Republicans and people who were Democrats based on whether they like college basketball, college football better. I mean, it was not absolute, particularly in Florida because college football is so big here. But in other parts of the country, I could tell, right? If someone was a basketball fan, they tended to be a little further to the left. If they were a football fan, they tended to be a little further to the right. Not absolute. I'm not trying to stereotype everyone, but there was actually something to that. And then I would even notice that was the case with the coaches. Like Dean Smith was, very liberal guy. I think you go to college football, you get guys like, well, now most recently Lou Holtz, and he's always been a conservative, but guys like him and Dabo Swinney and so many others that have been very conservative. So I think it's tough in the NFL. I don't know what the owners, most of whom are Republicans, are going to do. A lot of them have given a lot of money to Donald Trump and to other Republican officials, and they see this as very partisan. At the same time, they have to have some empathy and understanding for their players. It's more natural for the NBA. Adam Silver is himself kind of a Renaissance guy. David Stern, the late David Stern, was also. So I think it's pretty easy for a LeBron or a Steve Kerr, those kinds of guys who are active, Greg Popovich, activists on these issues, to go to Adam Silver and previously David Stern and say, hey, this is how we feel. And, the NBA has done nothing to rein in LeBron and Steve Kerr. Those two guys in particular have been very outspoken about Trump, right? And very public about it. But the NFL is different, and Major League Baseball is different. And I don't know how long MLB is going to let this go. And NFL, I have a sense it might be a non-starter. There's even, you even see these divisions over COVID. There's a reason why, in my opinion, the Big Ten said, no, we're not going to play, and the SEC is pushing forward. I mean, the fan bases are different, the schools are different, but even like the administration of the schools are different in some of these places. So I think it's a big challenge for the owners in professional leagues. My sympathy is always going to be with the players. And in general, I mean, I'll admit that one of the areas where I try and be objective, but then I lose my objectivity is when there's labor issues involving players. And I'm always come down on the side of players versus management, except in very rare instances, which I think is different than most fans. Most fans tend to side with management. And I found people who are in broadcasting and in journalism like us tend to side with the players. So that's maybe obviously my politics comes into this, but I think it's also just when you're a journalist, when you're a broadcaster, you get to know the players, you understand their plight, you understand kind of the human interest side of their careers. Whereas I think fans are very attached to teams more than players, right? And they're attached to their owners for whatever reason, so they tend to take the owner's side. So the whole BLM thing, I think, also is kind of a reflection of how sometimes we see labor negotiations, and the NBA players are gonna strike. I'm with the players, right? This was many years ago, obviously, but I'm with the players. I'm generally never with management on these things.
I agree, Kartik, with the situation that we've seen it from all sides. And you brought up a good point about the owners were different leagues. The NFL, the Cowboys are still winning. Jerry Jones, were you going to say something about this? Or in other leagues, I know.
Look, and actually I should say, sorry, Josh, but just one other point. Yeah. There probably is a Steve Kerr and a LeBron James in the NFL. They just can't speak out, right? Mm-hmm. That's the point, right? The NBA is not going to do anything to Greg Popovich when he attacks Trump. But if the coach of I don't know of any NFL team was as outspoken as Popovich, I don't know what would happen. He might get blackballed from the league. We saw what happened to Colin Kaepernick. I do not believe that would have happened to Colin Kaepernick in the NBA. I'm going to just be perfectly blunt about it. I think it would have gone a completely different direction if he were a basketball player. Not because of the way the league is structured, because of the relationship between the league and its players, because the league's fan base is very different than the fan base of the NFL, and because ultimately the owners are very different than the NFL owners. So, yeah, sorry, but that's I should have added that.
No, that's a good point you mentioned, and I was just going to say, even in MLS, I was seeing on Twitter today about the situation with Real Salt Lake.
Yeah, yeah.
Delroy Hansen had made some comments on the radio show that he doesn't seem to understand why the players are striking or doing this or doing that, and there's talk now where Josie Altor was like, "You don't understand, like just sell the team, like I'll buy the team." So I'm not sure how that's going to play out, but no, you're right. As much as we've seen it from the players, some owners have been very quiet.
Yeah, I was going to say on the Delroy Hansen thing, it really surprised me because I thought he did a really good thing in NWSL when he bought FC Kansas City, whose owner had made some ridiculous comments, similar kind of bigoted comments, and put a lot of money into on the women's side. The women's soccer players have been particularly outspoken. I mean, Megan Rapinoe was the first white athlete to back Kaepernick. Let's not forget that 4 years ago. So and she started kneeling in solidarity with him. I think there was also some solidarity in that Rapinoe was actually from Northern California, so she's probably a 49ers fan. That might have been part of what prompted it, but she's obviously very socially conscious and social activist. And that Delroy Hansen had put a lot of money into women's soccer, knowing this, knowing the political opinions of Megan Rapinoe and of Alex Morgan and of other. Alex Morgan's very outspoken on these issues also, and other top women's soccer players. I mean, the entire team is a team of progressive leftists, the U.S. Women's national team, right? Maybe with one or two exceptions. But that's why I was so surprised by his comments today, because if he is one of those conservative sports owners, which I totally get, most of them are, I am shocked that he had put so much money into soccer to this point and now says, well, maybe this is going to threaten my investment in the future. I love the way Josie Altidore came back at him. I don't know if that means he's going to retrench and back off on this, or if he'll say, okay, Josie, put together a group. I'm going to sell the team to you. We'll see. We'll see how that plays out. But I was actually very surprised by it because I didn't think he was that type.
All right, Kartik. Well, before you go, I have one more question for you. I know you're a diehard Manchester City fan. So, with all these rumors about, we've seen a few days ago, Lionel Messi saying he's going to leave Barcelona. He wants to leave. And there's been rumors that he's going to come to Manchester City. So, Kartik, do you think Lionel Messi will end up at Manchester City?
I think that there's probably a 50-50 chance. I think if I had to bet, I would say yes. I am concerned based on some of the reports we've seen, and I think I tweeted this a few nights ago, that 5 years ago I would have been the one chasing this story because I had so many contacts in and around the club, in and around Manchester City, new player agents. Some of those relationships have kind of dissipated as I've gotten kind of deeper into the American soccer scene and deeper into covering the media rather than covering the tactics and stuff. So that's one knock-on effect of us changing our format of World Soccer Talk to being about media and broadcasting. But I would have been chasing the story is the point if this had been 5 years ago. I think there's a better than 50-50 chance. I do think, though, from a Man City perspective, I'm concerned we're going to sell too many guys, right? We're either going to offload guys to make room under FFP for Messi, or we're going to swap them directly with Barcelona. And I saw reports today of Bernardo Silva, Gabriel Jesus, Eric Garcia. We know Garcia wants to go to Barcelona anyway, so that makes sense. But the other two, I'm not too keen on parting with. If we had to part with one of them, maybe you let Jesus go. I am not in any way for selling Bernardo Silva to get Messi for what, maybe 2 more years at the top level. So we'll see what happens. But I think there's a better than 50-50 chance. I also think Manchester City thinks this is a marketing move. And of course it is, because the number of shirts you're going to sell. Think about how the Lakers came back just getting LeBron, getting those shirt sales, and Juventus with Ronaldo. It is such a big part of what happens now in sports is shirt sales. And City have won a lot since the takeover, right? In the last 8 years, City have won 4 Premier Leagues and 5 other trophies. However, City hasn't had really that outstanding marketable player yet. They Aguero, kind of, De Bruyne, but never that 100 million or 150 million pound player that you can market. I do think, though, and we can finish on this, since we've talked so much about Black Lives Matter today, and we talk so much about social issues and the consciousness that's been the awareness that's been raised around sports. Raheem Sterling, I think, is now maybe in that category, because I think there are so many people who are um, on kind of the BLM side of things who say, my gosh, what he's had to go through, the racism he's had to face, how he's become this just great spokesperson for these societal causes. And I would include Marcus Rashford across town, Man United in that too, that these two guys have now elevated their stock. And I think a lot more people want to buy Sterling shirts because of his social activism as much as him being a great player. But City, I think, want that guy that they can really market, and that would obviously, now there's no one you could market better than Messi in world sports, other than maybe, again, LeBron and Tiger Woods, right? He's on the pedestal with those two guys.
And Kartik, what do you think about, we've also heard rumors about the MLS out clause, that you might go to New York City FC after.
That's actually really interesting to me, because I think it's got a Pele aspect to it, right? The greatest player of this generation ending his career helping to sell America on soccer and being in New York, being in the biggest media center on the planet. I think it's pretty appealing. I do think that what will end up happening is he will go to Manchester for 3 years and then end up finishing up in New York for 3 years. He's not coming to MLS now, but that's really interesting. We thought, and I'm surprised it hasn't been used as much. We thought when New York City FC started, Manchester City was going to attract players to City to play in Manchester for a year or two by doing that, saying, hey, then you could finish up in New York. And it only happened with Frank Lampard. That's the only player it happened with. Everybody else either went directly to New York City FC or have gone to Manchester City and then been sold on or still with the team. So it's a really interesting concept. It's something I thought would happen more often. And I think it'll be really great in this case. It'll be great for soccer in the United States.
Kartik, I just want to, again, thank you for taking time to share with us your insights on your career with World Soccer Talk and some insights on the beautiful game.
Great. Yeah, thank you, Josh. Yeah, keep up the good work.
And that was Kartik Krishnaiyer, writer and co-host on the World Soccer Talk podcast. Tune in next week as we'll have from the Major Arena Soccer League, Orlando Seawolves head coach Tom Traxler on the show. That will conclude this edition of The Hot Seat on Full Sail Live. I'm Josh Taylor. Take care of yourselves. Enjoy your weekend. And I'll see you next time.